The air inside Los Angeles County Courthouse was thick, almost suffocating. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, murmuring among themselves, eyes flickering between the judge's bench and the young man standing at the defendant's table. It was an odd sight. Ethan Carter, just 19 years old, standing there with his hands in his pockets, his chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp, something dangerous. Judge Henry Wallace sat high above, peering down at Ethan over the rim of his glasses. He was a man who had seen thousands of cases in his years on the bench. Most of them were forgettable. Another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. This one wouldn't be any different. Wallace let out a long breath and glanced at the file in front of him. Grand theft auto. Resisting arrest. Serious charges. The boy was just another reckless kid who got himself into trouble. At least, that's what he thought. Leaning back in his chair, Wallace tapped his fingers against the polished wood of his desk and smirked. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" he asked, his voice carrying a dry amusement. "This isn't a high school debate club, son." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the court reporter, even Daniel Brooks, the prosecutor, allowed himself a small smirk. They all thought they knew how this story ended, but Ethan wasn't laughing. Across the room, Daniel Brooks adjusted his tie, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who had won more cases than he could count. His navy blue suit was immaculate, his watch glimmering under the harsh courtroom lights. He approached the jury box with slow, deliberate steps, his voice smooth, practiced. "Your Honor," he began, "the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Ethan Carter, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle. A 2022 BMW 7 Series, reported missing just hours before his arrest." A murmur spread through the gallery. "A stolen luxury car? That didn't sound like an accident." Brooks continued, flipping through his notes. "Officers pursued him through downtown after he attempted to flee, before finally taking him into custody. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself." The words landed like a hammer. It sounded bad, really bad. Judge Wallace glanced at Ethan again, his eyes narrowing. "Go on." Brooks stepped closer to the jury, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with each step. "The defense may try to convince you that this is all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Carter is just an unfortunate victim of circumstance." Then, for the first time, he turned and locked eyes with Ethan. "But let's be honest," Brooks said, voice lowering slightly, just enough to make the moment dramatic. "What kind of victim runs from the police?" The air shifted. Tension thickened. Judge Wallace leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. A few jury members stiffened in their seats. The spectators in the gallery whispered among themselves. Ethan still didn't blink. Brooks exhaled through his nose and pulled out another sheet of paper. "Your Honor," he said, "I have here the testimony of Officer Mark Ellison, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before attempting to flee." Wallace nodded, flipping through the case file. "Sounds straightforward to me." And for most people in the room, it probably did. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. What more was there to discuss? But Ethan had spent years studying trials. He knew every trick, every strategy, every shortcut prosecutors took to win convictions. He could already see the cracks. Still, he said nothing. Not yet. Judge Wallace tapped his gavel lightly. "All right, let's hear from the defense." He turned to the defense table where Amanda Lawson, Ethan's appointed public defender, sat. She had barely spoken since stepping into the courtroom, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. She hesitated before rising. "Your Honor, my client?" But Ethan placed a hand on her arm, a silent request. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she sat back down. And for the first time, Ethan Carter spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." A wave of silence rippled through the courtroom. Judge Wallace arched an eyebrow, clearly amused. "You'll what?" Ethan's voice was calm, steady, unshaken. "I'll be defending myself." A stunned murmur spread through the room. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Brooks's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a sharp laugh. "This should be interesting." But no one was laughing anymore when Ethan took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. The murmurs in the courtroom hadn't settled yet. A defendant representing himself? It was unheard of. especially a 19-year-old kid facing felony charges. The gallery buzzed with whispers, some amused, some skeptical. Judge Wallace adjusted his glasses, leaning forward slightly. He had expected a simple case, a quick ruling, and then he'd be out of here. But this was different. You wanted to defend yourself? Wallace's voice carried a note of dry disbelief. He studied Ethan carefully, trying to gauge if this was arrogance, desperation, or something else entirely. Ethan held his gaze, his expression unreadable. Yes, Your Honor. A slow, deliberate silence followed. Across the room, Daniel Brooks let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. That's cute, he muttered under his breath, flipping through his case file with a smirk. He didn't even look worried. Judge Wallace sighed, rubbing his temple. You understand the risks, Mr. Carter? His tone was patient, almost condescending. This isn't a movie. If you mess this up, you're looking at serious time. Ethan nodded once. I understand. Amanda Lawson, his appointed public defender, shifted uncomfortably beside him. She had been silent for most of the proceedings, but now she leaned in slightly, whispering, Ethan, this isn't a good idea. Let me help. But Ethan shook his head. Thank you, Miss Lawson, he said quietly, but I've got this. She hesitated, then reluctantly sat back down, her face tight with concern. Judge Wallace exhaled, clearly irritated. Very well, he said, then let's proceed. He gestured toward the prosecutor's table. Mr. Brooks, you may continue. Brooks smirked as he rose to his feet, buttoning his suit jacket with slow precision. He wasn't worried. Not even a little. Thank you, Your Honor, he said smoothly. I'll make this quick. He turned, strolling toward the jury with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I'd like you to take a good look at the young man standing before you. He gestured toward Ethan without even glancing at him. He looks confident, doesn't he? Composed, almost like he belongs here, like he's one of us. Brooks smiled, shaking his head. But let's not forget why we're here today. He took a step closer to the jury. This is not a classroom. This is not a school debate. This is a court of law, and this young man is not here because he signed up for an extracurricular activity. He's here because he was caught in a stolen vehicle, evading police. His voice grew sharper, each word landing with weight. And now he wants to play lawyer. Another ripple of chuckles passed through the courtroom. Even Judge Wallace's lips twitched slightly. But Ethan still didn't react. Brooks finally turned to face him directly. Tell me, Mr. Carter, he said, tilting his head. What exactly qualifies you to argue this case? A few YouTube videos? A couple of episodes of Law and Order? The courtroom laughed again. Ethan smiled faintly. Not because he found it funny, but because Brooks had just made his first mistake. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan reached for the glass of water on the table, took a sip, and then set it down without a sound. What qualifies me? He repeated, his voice cool, measured. He stepped forward just slightly. I grew up watching trials, Mr. Brooks, Ethan said. While other kids memorized sports stats, I memorized case law. While my friends played video games, I studied legal arguments. I know the rules of this game better than you think. His eyes locked onto Brooks, unwavering. So go ahead, Ethan said, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. Try me. The laughter in the courtroom died instantly. The laughter had died. For the first time since the trial began, the room was still. Judge Wallace shifted in his chair, watching Ethan with newfound curiosity. Something had changed. The cocky confidence of the prosecution had started to fray at the edges, and the jury had stopped smiling. Ethan took a slow breath, stepping forward, his hands still casually tucked into his pockets. He let the silence stretch, just long enough to make everyone feel it. Then he spoke. Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution. Daniel Brooks arched an eyebrow, arms crossing over his chest. Go ahead. Ethan turned slightly, tilting his head. Mr. Brooks, you stated that Officer Mark Ellison personally witnessed me behind the wheel before I was arrested. That's in his official report, correct? Brooks let out a small sigh, already bored. That's right. Ethan nodded. And that testimony is being presented as fact? Brooks smirked, shaking his head. Of course it is, Carter. That's how evidence works. Ethan's lips curled into the faintest smirk. Good. Because I'd like to move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Wallace squinted. On what grounds? Ethan finally pulled his hands from his pockets, his posture shifting slightly, not cocky, not defensive, but composed. "Because Officer Ellison never saw me in that car," Ethan said evenly. "In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." For the first time, Brooks blinked. "What are you talking about?" the prosecutor snapped. Ethan took a slow step forward. "Your Honor, if the court allows, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ellison's GPS logs from that night." Wallace frowned. "Explain." Ethan's voice remained steady, controlled. "If Ellison's report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then his location history should back that up. But—" he let the words hang for a moment. "I have a feeling it won't." The gallery erupted in whispers. Brooks cleared his throat, visibly tense now. "That report was filed by a trained officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a professional?" Ethan shrugged casually. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't—" he let the sentence drift into silence. Judge Wallace turned slowly toward Brooks. "Does the prosecution have any objection to verifying the officer's GPS records?" The pause was too long, too noticeable. The jury saw it, the gallery saw it, and most importantly, Judge Wallace saw it. Brooks cleared his throat again, his jaw tight. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing. The courtroom was silent. But the tension? It was deafening. The silence in the courtroom was thick, weighted with unspoken doubt. Ethan stood at the defense table, his expression calm, unreadable. Across from him, Brooks had lost a bit of his earlier swagger. His fingers tapped against the prosecution's table as he glanced toward Judge Wallace, then back at Ethan. "Your Honor," Brooks said, clearing his throat, "while we wait for the GPS records, let's not ignore the overwhelming evidence that remains." He turned to the jury, regaining his composure. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. He let the words settle, pacing slowly in front of them. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's use common sense. You don't accidentally leave your fingerprints on a car unless you were inside it. The evidence speaks for itself." A few members of the jury nodded slightly. Judge Wallace glanced at Ethan. "Mr. Carter, care to respond?" Ethan nodded once. He stepped forward, clasping his hands behind his back, casual, controlled. "Mr. Brooks says the evidence speaks for itself," Ethan said. "But let's actually listen to what it's saying." A pause. "The prosecution wants you to believe that because my fingerprints were found in the car, that means I must have stolen it. That's their entire argument. But let's think about this logically." He turned slightly, making eye contact with the jury. "Imagine you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You slip your hands into the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack and walk out." He shrugged. "Now, a few hours later, someone else steals that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you were the one who took it?" A few members of the jury exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. Ethan didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a convenience store hours before the alleged theft. "I was inside that store with 3 friends, and yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door, because it was already unlocked." He spread his hands slightly. "It was stupid. A dumb moment of curiosity. But I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. I didn't steal anything from inside." Ethan let the words hang in the air before his voice dropped. Smooth and deliberate. "Does touching something make you a criminal?" The courtroom was still. For the first time, Brooks' confident posture shifted. He flipped through his notes, searching for a counterpoint, something to regain control. But Ethan wasn't finished. "And while we're on the topic of evidence," he continued, turning to Judge Wallace, "was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify?" Judge Wallace blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Brooks. The prosecutor hesitated. Then, reluctantly, "No." Ethan gave a small nod, his lips pressing together like he had just confirmed something. "So let me get this straight," he said, tilting his head. "The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence?" Brooks stiffened. "No chance for me to cross-examine? No chance to ask about the chain of custody? No chance to challenge the accuracy of the analysis?" More murmurs spread through the gallery. Brooks stayed silent. Ethan nodded as if that was all he needed to hear. Interesting. Judge Wallace sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man realizing this case was no longer the easy win he had assumed it would be. But Ethan wasn't done yet, because what he was about to say next, it would change everything. The tension in the courtroom was thick, almost suffocating. Everyone was still processing the weight of Ethan's last statement. Even Judge Wallace, who had maintained a sense of control throughout the trial, seemed caught off guard by the defendant's calm precision. He leaned back in his chair, looking between Ethan and the prosecutor, as if weighing the words still hanging in the air. But Ethan wasn't finished. His voice was now low, steady, with the faintest hint of something almost dangerous. "Your Honor," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "I have one more piece of the puzzle to present." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, but Ethan continued, his eyes never leaving the judge. "I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle, Mr. James Holloway, the registered owner of the stolen BMW." Brooks looked up from his notes, suddenly on edge. "Objection, Your Honor. We've already established that the defendant's fingerprints were on the car." Ethan raised a hand, silencing the prosecutor with a simple motion. "I'm not disputing that my fingerprints were found on the car," Ethan said calmly. "But what I am disputing is the fact that this critical piece of evidence was never presented to the court." The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. James Holloway's statement. It hadn't been mentioned before. Why? Ethan pulled out a folded sheet of paper, the crinkling sound loud in the sudden stillness. He held it up for everyone to see, his eyes never leaving the judge. "Here's what Mr. Holloway told the officers the night his car was reported stolen." Ethan began, reading aloud with calm precision. "I left my car running while I ran into the convenience store. When I came back out, some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Ethan lowered the paper, his eyes now scanning the room. The gasp that rippled through the gallery was almost audible. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others looked at each other, stunned. The truth had just been laid bare, and the prosecution had conveniently ignored it. Brooks was standing now, his face flushed, but his voice was defensive, a far cry from the confident prosecutor who had entered the courtroom. "Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant. The defendant was found in possession of the vehicle, and that's what matters," Brooks said, his words quick, desperate. "The victim is mistaken. The police acted on the facts available to them." Ethan didn't flinch. He turned toward the jury, his voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. "Mr. Holloway's statement isn't irrelevant, Mr. Brooks. It's the very reason we're here today." He stepped forward, locking eyes with each jury member. The real thief was never caught. A long pause hung between his words. "The officers found a black kid near the car, and they just assumed I was the one who stole it. It didn't matter that I didn't fit the description, or that I wasn't even in the car when it was taken. What mattered was that I was easy to target, easy to blame." A shift had occurred. The room was no longer filled with doubt about Ethan's innocence. It was filled with anger at the system that had allowed this to happen. Judge Wallace was studying the situation carefully, his brow furrowed. He glanced toward Brooks, who was visibly struggling to maintain his composure. Ethan continued, his voice firm but measured. "This case isn't about me, Your Honor. It's about the fact that the police chose the easiest suspect. They ignored the truth, ignored the real thief, and arrested me instead." The prosecutor opened his mouth to object but stopped himself. There was nothing left to say. Ethan had just torn apart the prosecution's entire case. The gallery was silent, the air thick with the weight of Ethan's words. The realization was sinking in. Ethan wasn't just defending himself, he was exposing the flaws in the justice system, flaws that had been swept under the rug for far too long. Ethan took a step back, his gaze flickering briefly toward Judge Wallace, who had yet to speak. The judge's expression was unreadable, but the uncertainty in his eyes told Ethan everything he needed to know. Judge Wallace finally sighed, rubbing his temple as he leaned back in his chair. His eyes flickered toward the jury, then back to Ethan. The room was still, But the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. The truth had been revealed. The case was no longer a simple matter of stolen property. It was a matter of justice. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. The courtroom, once filled with quiet chuckles and dismissive glances, was now utterly silent. The truth had been dragged into the light, and no one, not the jury, not the judge, not even the prosecutor, could ignore it. Judge Wallace exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple as he absorbed the magnitude of what had just been exposed. Across the room, Daniel Brooks had gone rigid, his earlier confidence unraveling before everyone's eyes. He tried to maintain his composure, but there was no denying it anymore. He was losing control. Ethan, meanwhile, remained steady. He could feel the tension in the room shift in his favor, but he didn't celebrate. Not yet. He had spent years watching trials, studying every trick, every flaw, every shortcut prosecutors used to tip the scales against defendants like him. He knew that even when backed into a corner, the system would fight back. And Brooks did just that. "Your Honor," Brooks said, his voice clipped, "even if we disregard the victim's mistaken identification, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." His words came fast, as if he was grasping at the last fraying threads of his case. "That is forensic evidence. It is indisputable. It places him inside the vehicle." He turned sharply to the jury, forcing authority back into his voice. "The defense wants you to believe that touching something doesn't make you guilty. That's a nice sentiment, but let's be clear. His prints weren't found on the hood of the car or the door handle or a window. They were on the steering wheel." A flicker of relief crossed Brooks' face as a few jurors nodded slightly, seemingly considering his words. He latched on to that hesitation, pressing forward. "This is not speculation. This is hard evidence." His voice rose, pushing past his earlier uncertainty. "And no amount of courtroom theatrics changes that fact." Silence. Brooks had made his last stand. All eyes turned to Ethan. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. Ethan took a slow, deliberate step forward. He didn't rush. He let the weight of Brooks' argument settle. Let the jurors think about it. Let them question it. Then he spoke. "Let's talk about that evidence." The words were quiet, measured. "The prosecution is asking you to believe that my fingerprints prove I was the one who stole the car. But here's the problem with that." He turned to Judge Wallace, tilting his head. "Your Honor, was the forensic analyst who processed the fingerprint evidence subpoenaed to testify?" Wallace blinked. Ethan already knew the answer. "No, Mr. Carter," the judge admitted. Ethan nodded as if he had just confirmed something. "So let me get this straight," he said, turning back to the jury. "The prosecution built their entire case on forensic evidence, yet didn't feel the need to bring in the one person who could confirm the accuracy of that evidence?" Brooks shifted uncomfortably. Ethan let his words sink in, then went in for the final blow. No cross-examination, no chance to question the chain of custody, no opportunity to ask how the evidence was collected, analyzed, or stored. His eyes locked onto the jury, one by one. "Does that sound like justice to you?" The courtroom was no longer silent. It was boiling. The courtroom was no longer just a room filled with people. It was a pressure cooker, and every single person inside could feel it about to burst. Judge Wallace sat motionless, his fingers steepled under his chin, his expression unreadable. He had watched thousands of cases unfold in this very room. But this one? This was different. This was a case that had started as open and shut, yet had unraveled before everyone's eyes. Across the aisle, Daniel Brooks sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the prosecution table. He had nothing left. The evidence, the very foundation of his case, had been picked apart, exposed for its gaping holes. And then there was Ethan Carter. He stood at the defense table, hands clasped, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He had done what no one expected. He had taken apart the prosecution's case piece by piece, brick by brick, until there was nothing left standing. Judge Wallace let out a slow breath and adjusted his glasses. Then, finally, he spoke. "Mr. Carter, stand up." Ethan rose, steady, unshaken. Wallace's gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on the jury before returning to Ethan. He tapped his gavel lightly against the desk, then delivered the words that no one had expected to hear when this trial began. "Case dismissed." For a moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Gasps, Murmurs. Reporters scrambling to write down the words that would dominate headlines within the hour. The gallery erupted in whispers, some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. But Ethan, he didn't move. He let the moment settle, let the reality sink in. For everyone. The echoes of Judge Wallace's gavel still lingered in the air, but the courtroom was already unraveling into chaos. Reporters clutched their notebooks, scrambling toward the exit to be the first to break the story. Spectators whispered in hushed, urgent tones, casting glances at the young man who had just done the unthinkable. Ethan Carter had walked into this courtroom as a defendant. Now he was walking out as something else entirely. He didn't rush. He didn't celebrate. He simply exhaled, letting the tension slowly drain from his shoulders. But as he turned toward the exit, a voice stopped him. "Mr. Carter." Ethan paused. Judge Wallace sat at his bench, watching him with an expression that was no longer dismissive, no longer amused. There was something else in his gaze now, something closer to respect. For a moment, the judge hesitated. Then, finally, he spoke. "You should consider law school." A few murmurs rippled through the remaining spectators, but Ethan didn't respond immediately. He simply smirked, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "I already have." With that, he turned and walked toward the doors. Outside, the courthouse steps were a battlefield of flashing cameras and microphones. "Ethan, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" Ethan ignored them all. Because waiting at the bottom of the steps was the only person who mattered, his mother, Sarah Carter. She stood still, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. For a long moment, she simply looked at him. Then finally she exhaled. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Ethan chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She shook her head but pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one." The cameras kept flashing, the reporters kept shouting, but Ethan wasn't listening anymore, because for the first time in weeks, maybe even months, he felt something he hadn't let himself feel before. Free. Ethan Carter walked out of the courthouse that day a free man. But the truth was, he was never supposed to be. If he hadn't known the law, if he hadn't fought back, if he had accepted the system's version of events, he would have been just another name on a conviction record. And that raises the real question. How many others weren't as lucky? How many people sat in courtrooms just like this one, without the knowledge, the resources, or the chance to defend themselves? How many were found guilty, not because of the evidence, but because the system was designed to move fast, close cases, and never look back? Ethan's victory wasn't just about proving his own innocence. It was about forcing the system to look at itself, and for once, making it blink first. But here's the thing. The system doesn't change on its own. It changes when we challenge it. It changes when we question it. It changes when we refuse to stay silent. Ethan Carter knew the law well enough to fight for himself. But what about those who don't? Who fights for them? Maybe the real question isn't what Ethan will do next. Maybe the real question is, what will you do? If this story made you think, even for a second, then share it. Talk about it. Because the more we talk, the more we question, and the more we question, the harder it is for injustice to hide. And if you want more stories like this, stories that matter, hit that subscribe button and follow along. Because next time, it might not be Ethan. It might be someone you know.